Birthdays are a good occasion to go through the family photograph album and remember, as Presbyterians, where we've come from. There's never enough time for all the stories that cluster around old photos, but here are some of them in the hope that as we reminisce about how previous generations responded to the gospel, that we would hear Christ's call for us in our time.
Pierre Chauvin, a Huguenot, established the first fur trading center at Tadoussac in 1600.
French Huguenots dominated the early years of the fur trade, as Scots Presbyterians did after the conquest. Fur money built the first Protestant church in Quebec, St. Gabriel's in Montreal.
John Bethune, its first minister, was the great-great-grandfather of Dr. Norman Bethune, surgeon hero of Chairman Mao's Red Army.
Presbyterians arrived with the early settlement of Nova Scotia. Not all of them Gaelic-speaking Highlanders. The first ordination took place in the German-Dutch settlement of Lunenburg. And there were Dutch and German Presbyterians among the Loyalists in Upper Canada. For most of the first 125 years, the Presbyterian Church, indeed Canada itself, was dominated by Scots.
The Fathers of Confederation included Presbyterians George Brown, owner and editor of the Toronto Globe, Liberal leader, Free Church, anti-papist, abstainer, and John A. Macdonald, easygoing, Church of Scotland, willing to drink amiably with French Roman Catholics and anybody else required for his various schemes. He once described himself as a pillar of the Kirk, albeit an outside pillar. Shortly after the constitutional ink was dry, negotiations to establish a Presbyterian church from sea to sea began in Montreal, then the center of Canadian Presbyterianism.
On a 10-block stretch on either side of what is now René Lévesque Boulevard, Presbyterians had their choice of worshiping at St. Andrew's, St. Paul's, Knox, Erskine, Stanley Street, the American, or Crescent Street Church. When the Union of 1875 came about, the Presbyterian Church in Canada became the largest Protestant church in the country.
The perceived mission was to transform the political and geographical entity called Canada into God's dominion. The Reverend Robert Murray, editor of the Presbyterian Witness, summed up this aspiration in his hymn, From Ocean Unto Ocean.
But how could the rough-and-tumble nation that politicians like MacDonald had stitched together with patronage and railroads become God's country? Part of the answer lay in moral distinctions from our neighbor to the south. Some of these may have tended towards sanctimonious humbug, but others had some basis in fact.
Pa should have been here by now. He's 3 hours late already. Pa ain't gonna make it! One of them slave catchers got someone to help, and I just know
Liza, you both made it past the border yesterday. We've all done this before.
He's our pa. He'll be here.
Come, let's pray.
No more praying! Liza! Liza!
Between 1840 and 1860, more than 30,000 American slaves came secretly to Canada and freedom. They called it the Underground Railroad.
Lisa!
Pa!
Pa! We're free!
Yes, Pa, we're in Canada!
The fight against slavery was a long one in Canada. In 1788, the Reverend James McGregor of Pictou, Nova Scotia, spent the best part of a year's paycheck to buy the freedom of 2 female Nova Scotian slaves and refused fellowship with another Presbyterian minister who owned them.
The Reverend William King established the Buxton Mission near Chatham, Ontario in 1851 for American blacks fleeing slavery via the Underground Railroad. Michael Willis, principal of Knox College, was the first and only president of the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada.
The press referred to the vice president, Dwight James, as the African consul in Montreal. The board included the aforementioned George Brown and Oliver Mowat, Liberal Premier of Ontario, president of the Evangelical Alliance of Canada.
Canadians also prided themselves on avoiding the genocide of Native peoples that took place south of the 49th parallel. The economic requirements of the fur trade necessitated cooperation and encouraged intermarriage.
The first Presbyterian congregation in the Canadian Northwest at Kildonan, Manitoba, was comprised of Hudson Bay Company factors like Alexander Ross, his wife, Sally, daughter of an Okanagan chief, and their children. In 1866, the congregation sent out a missionary party to what is now Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. Most of them were related. The Reverend James and Mrs. Nisbet, her sister, Christine, and brother-in-law John Mackay and Mary Ross, married to George Flett. Her sister, Henrietta, was married to John Black, the first settled Presbyterian minister on the prairies.
Of the whole missionary group, Nisbet was the only one who could not claim native ancestry. Presbyterians thus straddled the racial and linguistic divisions of the Great Lone Land. Flett and his wife were fluent in Cree and Saulteaux, French, as well as English. When natives objected to the proposed Prince Albert agricultural settlement, Flett claimed a portion of land by virtue of his mother and transferred his rights to the mission. Gardens were planted, houses built, and then, of course, a school with a Cree reader. In 1870, when smallpox ravaged Indian bands across the prairies, Nisbet successfully vaccinated several hundred people at the mission.
Lucy Baker, an independent spirit from Glengarry, taught the Sioux in their own language when they sought sanctuary in Canada after the unfortunate incident with General Custer at Little Bighorn.
Commissioner McLeod, where are the rest of your men?
You've got more men back there than I have in the whole of Western Canada.
Yeah, but Sitting Bull held a war dance last night.
General Terry in Canada, Sitting Bull has kept the Queen's peace. He's agreed to meet with you.
And the Spotted Eagle. That face doesn't look ready to come back to the States without a fight.
President Hayes says you will be received kindly and...
The grandmother's medicine house is no place for lies. Not two more words. This country does not belong to you. We will stay here and keep the grandmother's peace. She will let us raise our children. We do not want lies. These men, Walsh, McLeod, they're the first white men who never lied to us.
I didn't know then that they'd be starved out of Canada and go back to the States. Walsh would resign over it, and Sitting Bull would be murdered.
MacLeod graduated in classics and philosophy at Queen's and was one of Sir John A. Macdonald's many friends.
Annie McLaren ran the residential school at Birtle. Parents pitched teepees in the schoolyard when they came to visit. Elders Alexander Morris and David Laird played central parts in negotiating federal treaties with native peoples and in shaping government policy so that they could become, quote, loyal subjects of the Crown, happy, prosperous, and self-sustaining. On Laird's death, native peoples mourned the passing of, quote, the man who talks straight. A few years before the Riel Rebellion, Chief Mistawassis invited John Mackay to establish a church and school on his reserve. He remained loyal to the Crown during the unrest. His reward included a tour of eastern Canada on the new railroad. When he got back, he told Mackay that he and his companion, Star Blanket, contributed to the customary Victorian after-dinner entertainments with the hymn Old Hundredth in Cree.
The relationship has not always avoided the taint of racism and contempt, but it is more complicated than one might gather from some politicians and media reports. Mackay's successors at Mistawassis have included Stephen Howe, and the tradition of intermarriage continues in the life of Saskatoon Native Circle with Stuart and Terry Folster.
My grandfather was a Presbyterian, my father was a Presbyterian, and I'm a Presbyterian, and my daughter is a Presbyterian, and